So we're continuing on in our third unit, social and political theory, and we've done a few things so far in this unit. First, we looked at a few different views of human nature, of the state of nature, of what society would be like if there aren't rules, laws, a government, police keeping people in line. As you may or may not remember, Rousseau and Hobbes basically had opposite views when it came to these questions. When it comes to Hobbes, how did he conceive of human nature? Are humans naturally good, or are they not naturally good? If they're not naturally good, what are they, according to Hobbes? Do you remember? Yeah. Yeah, kind of self-interested. Selfish might be, I don't know, too strong of a word. I don't know. It depends on what your definition of selfish is. But definitely looking out for themselves, right? And what Hobbes would then go on to say is because humans are naturally self-interested, motivated by passion, emotion, feeling, although because they do have a rational component to them, a rational faculty, they will use violence to achieve their ends in the state of nature, which is going to make the state of nature a violent, chaotic, bad place that we don't want to be in. In order to escape the state of nature, humans in communities band together to form a social contract and set up a sovereign who is going to rule over them to keep people in line. In this way, people give up a lot of their natural liberty so that they can have safety and security and work together and cooperate for social ends. Rousseau had a different kind of view. How did he conceive of humans? Not as motivated fundamentally by self-interest, but what? What are humans naturally? Well, just think about the opposite. If someone's not self-interested, what are they? Yeah. Peaceful, yeah. Cooperative. Good and kind and nice. You might say altruistic on a good day. This is how Rousseau conceives of human nature. Being a romantic thinker, he has an optimistic view of human nature, and therefore what the state of nature is going to be like for humans, and therefore kind of a negative, critical view of the emergence of the state, of private property, and government. Remember, he says that humans were actually best, healthiest, and happiest in the state of nature, and therefore when governments arose, when private property was introduced and we started engaging in these mass social and production practices, that ended up corrupting humans, making them worse off, making them greedy, ambitious, jealous. And this is in part due to the commodification of things and luxuries in human life, creating artificial needs within them, needs for things that they don't actually need. Well, now we're going to kind of take a step back today, because I think it would be useful to go over some of the primary political ideologies that have structured human social development and the development of society generally in the West. And to do that, we're going to look at an essay written by James Alexander in which he tries to provide a new definition of ideology so that we can better distinguish between the three primary ideologies that structure society and politics today: liberalism, conservatism, and socialism. So those three primary ideologies are what we're going to be talking about today. To do that, we're investigating the philosophy of this guy, James Alexander, who is an English writer and philosopher. He's concerned with analyzing and developing theories of politics, cosmopolitanism, imperialism, basically anything that you can conceivably connect to politics, he has thought about and perhaps written about at least a little bit, including theories of the state, whether or not tradition is a good thing for human society. But he's doing something a little bit specific in this piece. What he is trying to assert is that if we come up with a new definition of ideology, not only will that make it clear to us how the different primary ideologies are distinguished from one another, but it's also going to tell us what these different ideologies are going to prescribe and how they think we should socially and economically organize ourselves in human society. So he's going to be providing a new definition of ideology in this piece, and then he's going to be providing an analysis of these three primary ideologies in order to show that not only does this definition make sense, but it's more useful than the old definition of ideology that social and political theory has been relying on for a century or so. Any questions so far? All right, I'm going to assume y'all are good and you're following along. In this piece, then, what he's trying to accomplish is to provide a certain analysis of liberalism, conservatism, and socialism, and how each of these ideologies conceive of politics, and therefore how we should organize ourselves in society. What our government should look like, what kind of social policy we should have, the different values and ideals that these ideologies have, and therefore what proponents of these ideologies support and what they reject. Again, Alexander thinks that social and political theory for the last 100 years or so, maybe longer, has been kind of stuck in a rut, relying on this old definition of ideology, which conceives of an ideology as basically a collection of certain concepts. He brings up a few different issues that are within social and political theory that prevent us from distinguishing in a helpful way these different ideologies from one another. Using the old definition of ideology, it's not clear to us why all of the other different political ideologies you've heard of should fit into one of these three categories, or what makes them different from one another. And so he's trying to kind of fill that gap, fill that lacuna in social and political theory, to help us better understand how these are different and therefore what they're going to say about human life. These ideologies are going to comment on human nature, what kind of economic policies we should have, and what the ideal society looks like. And so the main question that he's trying to answer in this essay is why and how are conservatism and liberalism and socialism distinct from one another? Why are they the three primary ideologies? Why, when you open up a book on social and political theory, do you see these three primary ideologies discussed, and then other ideologies like anarchism, libertarianism, Marxism? Why are they different, put under these different categories then? Republicanism. Because those are also ideologies in their own right. So why are these three the primary ideologies? Why have we cashed it out in these terms? Well, he's going to try to answer that in this piece. To give you a little spoiler, what he's going to end up saying is that it's more helpful to think of an ideology as something that says that we ought to act in a certain way due to who or what we owe a debt to. And as we'll see, he's going to argue that all three of these ideologies think that we owe a debt to something different, which then informs how these different ideologies see human nature and how humans should exist in society together and what kind of laws and policies they should enact. So the old definition of ideology that social and political theory has been using for a long time is basically that it's a collection of concepts. According to the old definition, an ideology is a view or a collection of concepts which posit, explain, and justify the means and ends of human behavior. That is, they're trying to explain why humans get together, how they should organize themselves socially and economically, and then to try to justify these means of social organization, why they should be this way. Now, this definition is fine. It's a kind of a general definition of what makes an ideology. And under this definition, you can understand then why socialism or Marxism, communism, anarchism, libertarianism, why all these things are ideologies. But it doesn't tell you anything about what those ideologies say. It doesn't tell you anything about how those ideologies are distinct from one another. And, therefore, it doesn't imply anything about what those ideologies are going to say about how we should organize ourselves, what kind of government we should have, what kind of economic system we should rely on, a more free market system or a more communistic system, an open economy or a circular economy. So while this definition has been fine, Alexander thinks that, it's time to evolve our definition. Because if we bring on a more useful, more helpful definition, that's going to make some of these political matters a little clearer to us. People will better understand why we separate ideologies into one of these three camps: conservatism, liberalism, and socialism, and again, how they are different from one another. And so the new definition that he is providing in this piece, that he's arguing for, and then that he's going to use to explain and analyze the three primary ideologies, is that an ideology is a view about what ought to be thought, said, and done when it comes to political matters in terms of who or what we owe a debt to. So this is really important. This is the new thing, basically, that Alexander is adding here. He thinks that at the basis of every ideology, there is a claim about that we owe a debt to something or someone or a group of people. And therefore, what he's going to say about conservatism, liberalism, and socialism is that they're all going to have kind of a different conception of who or what we owe a debt to. And if we understand who or what these different ideologies think we owe a debt to, it'll become a lot clearer why it is they say what they say. And we can kind of deduce logically and infer inductively what these different ideologies are going to say about how we should run society on the basis of understanding who or what the ideology says we owe a debt to. So I'd like to give some examples in order to help make his definition a little clearer here. Remember, this is the definition he's using. Okay? You don't have to write this down again, but you can. He says that an ideology, we should view an ideology as a view about what ought to be thought, said, and done about politics in terms of who or what we owe a debt to. And he goes through three primary examples to help make this definition clearer in the essay. For example, under this definition, and I think if we just think about politics in general, we would say environmentalism is an ideology. Right? It has something to say about political matters, how we should organize ourselves, what kind of economy we should have. So in terms of this definition, if I say environmentalism is an ideology, what do you think environmentalism says we owe a debt to? Yeah, the environment. It's that easy, right? The environmentalist is going to say we owe some kind of debt to the environment. We owe a debt to our planet. Because it's only because our planet is a certain way and operates and functions a certain way that any of us are here at all, right? If it wasn't for the natural resources that are on the planet, how animals function in different ecosystems, how these ecosystems are connected, all of this is allowing us to live and be here today and do whatever it is that we want to do. And so we are reliant, we are dependent on the environment being a certain way. It has allowed us to live and survive in our current circumstances. The environment has given us a lot. It needs to be a certain way in order for us to live. So they're going to say, the environmentalists, we owe a debt to the environment. And then based on what we've just concluded here, it kind of becomes obvious the kinds of social and political obligations environmentalists are going to say that we have. If we owe a debt to the earth, that means we have to treat it a certain way, right? Then the next logical step is, that means, we have to respect the environment. We can't tramp all over it. Maybe that means we need to conceive ourselves as being part of an interlocking, giant, complex organic system, instead of seeing ourselves as its master, or just as its servant, perhaps, but a part of this whole thing, right? That works together, that is interdependent on its different parts. But of course, there are other ideologies that we can use to help make this definition clearer, right? We might say nationalism is an ideology. Under this definition, what would the nationalists say we owe a debt to? It's easy. It's right in the word. What does nationalism say we owe a debt to? Yeah, and for us that would be the United States. Yeah. The idea is something similar to what the environmentalists have going on here along this definition. We are only able to be here today because of the things that our nation has done in the past, because of the education our nation has provided to its people, because of the economic and the social policies that our nation has been engaging in. Similarly to the environment, our nation has given us a lot of things. It provides us with opportunities. It allows us to live without having to worry about being invaded in our neighborhood constantly, right? So because our nation has given us all of these things, the nationalists will say, we owe a certain debt to the nation. Maybe that means we ought to fight for it in certain circumstances, defend it in others, be patriotic in others. All of these flow from this idea, right, that we owe a debt to the nation. So there's another example for you. Let's go over one more. The last one that he goes over in this piece. One that is particularly germane to our times and has been for hundreds of years. We might say feminism is an ideology. According to this definition, what is feminism going to say we owe a debt to? Say that again? Right. Yeah, they're going to say we owe a debt to females or women, depending on how you cash it out. Why? Well, this is for lots of reasons. Women historically have been the ones to raise the children in the home. Without women, we wouldn't have children grow up and be able to survive and be able to socially function. Every person who ever comes into existence is born from a woman. So we owe our life to some woman in some sense, right? Your mother, she owes her life to her grandmother. Your father owes his life to his mother, right? And so because women are basically the creators of life, because they've done so many useful and important and necessary things in our society, the feminists are going to say we owe a certain debt to women. And they're also going to say we don't owe them a debt just because they've done these good things, but because they've been historically oppressed. And we need to make up for that discrimination in some way. So you can see this definition in practice, right? How it makes sense according to some of these ideologies. What Alexander is going to go on to say is that conservatism and liberalism and socialism are going to say we all owe a debt to the human person, but they're going to conceive of the human person or the self differently. What this is going to lead to is that liberalism and socialism and conservatism, because they conceive of the self differently, are going to say we have different political, social, moral, economic obligations to the human person. When Alexander says self here, what he means is the human person. He's not saying that these ideologies are saying we owe a debt to you, right? Myself. No, the self, the human person, the human. Okay? So he's going to contend that all these ideologies say we owe a debt to the human person, but because these ideologies all have a different conception of what makes a human person a person, that is going to unfold into different obligations, different policies about what it's going to look like to make up for that debt to the human person, how to fulfill that debt, carry it out. Okay? With these kind of general notes in place now, we're able to start digging into Alexander's analyses of these different ideologies. We're going to start by talking about liberalism, because this one is perhaps most germane to our lives. It permeates a lot of Western societies. The political philosophy of the United States is based on the theory of classical liberalism, which was pioneered by John Locke, John Stuart Mill, and from which the founding fathers borrowed in order to write our Declaration of Independence and our Constitution. You might say that Western political theory is extremely liberal. And what I mean by liberal is not left-leaning, but liberal in the classically liberal sense Alexander is about to describe here. This ideology is associated with a lot of concepts that we intuitively understand because our society is based on this view. It's associated with concepts like personal freedom, right? There's a big moral and social obligation people in the United States think they have towards others in this country, not to step on their personal freedoms, to defend their own personal freedoms. The idea is something like, and this is written into our founding documents, each human person should be able to kind of lead their life as they see fit, as long as they're not hurting anybody or breaking any laws. Right? This is why we have freedom of the press, freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of association. We're not compelled or forced to practice one religion or live one way of life over another. This ideology is also associated generally with toleration, in contrast to a lot of other societies across the globe. Now, you might not say that the United States is as tolerant and nice as you want it to be, but compared to other countries, we are extremely tolerant. Toleration forms the basis of one of the reasons why the U.S. is called the Great Melting Pot. Right? We are a multicultural society. People coming from a lot of different countries, emigrating, and mixing together to form kind of a new culture, bringing in their traditions and their values. All of these things are things generally that Americans will tolerate, whereas a lot of other countries are very sensitive to the changing of their culture and the changing of their traditions, right? In the U.S., we're a little bit more tolerant of that stuff. It's also associated with this idea of individualism. This idea that the individual is important, that we ought to respect the rights of the individual, not break laws and step on their freedoms, but respecting the individual wishes and goals and desires of each person, so long as they're not harming anybody or breaking any laws, right? We're not a very collectivistic society. This is kind of changing now insofar as people are aligning themselves with various identities and social groups. But there is a privileging of the protection of the individual written into our laws and our informal social policies. Similarly, liberalism is associated with the concepts of limited government, private property, having a free market economy. The Founding Fathers were particularly aware, to take the United States as an example, that having too large of a government is not a good thing. Again, if we want to respect the rights and liberties of individuals, we don't want the government coming in and stepping on people's toes and telling them how to live their lives, right? And we don't even really allow government to interfere in the market, in the economy too much. Sometimes we do to help break up monopolies or to make sure that products are being made according to certain safety standards. But in the West generally, which are classically liberal, we normally have a free market economy. That is the privatization of the means of production. People own their wealth as individuals, right? Unless you're a corporation, which is seen as an individual in our country, which is a little weird. Groups collectively don't own wealth. It's your wealth and property belongs to you. Your wealth and property belongs to you. You can do with it what you want, right? Nobody's forcing you to do something with it. And there's also this defense and privileging of private property in our country, right? This idea that everyone has the right to what they own. Nobody can come and take it away from them. We even have laws defending people's rights to kill people that trespass on their private property, right? So this is a big thing in our country and in classically liberal societies in general. And finally, there is this idea which goes along with individualism, that individuals are kind of responsible for their own fates in classically liberal societies. The idea is something like, if you aren't living your best life, well, you got to pull yourself up by your bootstraps, buddy. Right? Work hard. That is part of the American ethos. It's part of the critiques of why a lot of people who are more right-leaning will say that people are suffering inequality. It's because they're not working hard enough, or they're not making the right connections, so on and so forth. So rather than having super intense and wide-scale social safety nets, generally we let people succeed and fail on their own terms. Although maybe it's not as fair if we put it a little simplistically like that. But that's the idea, right? These are some of the founding ideas and values on which classically liberal societies and United States society is based. And so Alexander says, according to the classical liberal, whatever we want to achieve in the world can only be judged in terms of the fact that the fundamental debt is one owed to the self, or to the human person. That is, the way that we should conceive of politics, the social views, the social policies that we should have, the laws we should have, the kind of government that we should have, the rights that are afforded to people, are based on this idea that the individual is paramount. We got to respect the individual, let the individual do their thing, and not try to run their life for them. And you're familiar with a lot of these ideas, right? They're so second nature to you because you were brought up in a society on which these views are based, right? You've heard of these views. They're part of the way that you see the world in some sense, part of the way that you interact with others in society. Our country is based on these views strongly. And so this is the first of the primary ideologies. Liberalism, according to Alexander, says that we owe a debt to the self, or the human person, which should be free to exist and make decisions as it sees fit. We allow people in U.S. society to kind of live the life that they want to live, to do what they want to do. We don't force people to practice a religion. We don't force people to go to church on Sundays. We don't force people to drive a certain kind of car, or buy certain products, or have a certain house, live a certain way. People are allowed to succeed and fail according to their own life decisions. Because we value the individual so highly, and respecting the individual's wishes and desires, and not stepping on them. How this informs our social policy and our legal policy is that, based on the writings in which this view was formed, laws and policies require consent of the governed. This is why we have representation in Congress, right? The idea is something like we elect representatives on our own behalf who can therefore make the laws that are good for us, and we kind of consent to the formation of a lot of these laws in virtue of electing this person. So the government can't just do whatever it wants. According to John Locke, the purpose of the government is to safeguard the individual liberties of its people and to look out for the good of the people. That is the purpose and role of government, even if we might think it's become corrupted or strayed away from that path the last few hundred years. Thus, people's individual liberties, according to this ideology, should not be infringed upon. I can't just come take your pen or your pencil or your laptop or your property. I can't just invade your home and sleep in it. Say, I'm going to set up shop in your dorm room, right? That's mine. No. These are not things that we respect or abide by in this country. Because we are so classically liberal, we really do respect people's desires and wishes to kind of live however they want. Right? Autonomy is a really important concept in our society. We don't want to infringe on people's autonomy. Right? You're not going to force feed your depressive friend their antidepressants. You're not going to take away somebody's product if you feel like they're not using them in the most healthy way. No, you're just kind of, you might talk to them, but you're going to let them do their thing. Right? Now, the problem with this view, the primary problem that Alexander brings up, and there are lots of problems with all of the views that we're going to be discussing today. Okay, none of them are perfect. They all have weaknesses. But the one that Alexander brings up in this piece is that it conceives of the self in an improper or an incorrect way. Classical liberalism tends to view the human person as autonomous, rational, and separate and distinct from everyone else. That is, it doesn't discuss at all how social conditions, how the society in which you are brought up in, impacts the kind of individual that you are going to be. This is a common progressive and communistic or socialistic critique of how liberalism views the self. The classical liberal is going to say, each of you are individuals distinct from the other members of your society. But the socialist, or the critic of liberalism, is going to say, that's not actually true. People are not rational all the time. And the social conditions in which you're brought up in inform who you are. You are not separate from society. Society informs who you are, and then you inform what society is like, which then informs what you're like and what other people are like. So the critic is going to say this view is lacking in its concept of the self. The self is not this distinct, separate thing from everybody else. Rather, the self is something, the human person, the human individual, is someone who is intimately informed and influenced by the social conditions, the economic conditions, the racial conditions, the gender conditions in which they are raised. Does this critique make sense? To summarize it, it's basically, you are not a distinct individual. You are an individual that is the product of social conditions. So you're not something that's separate from what's going on around you. You are informed very strongly by all that stuff. Okay? Can anybody think of any other critiques of this ideology? Shouldn't be hard. A lot of them are floating around today, all the time. Why don't you turn to the person next to you and talk about this? What is the problem with the ideology that undergirds United States political philosophy? What's going wrong in society right now that is based on these views? Talk about it with the person next to you. You're totally right. Yeah.
Like, look at the way he governed. That was a self-interested decision. Fighting I just don't understand how it got passed at a time when Roe v. Wade should have got passed, but it got overturned at a time when it should be.
Yeah, that doesn't make sense.
And it was by a more diverse Supreme Court. It was by a more diverse Supreme Court. How did that happen?
Okay. Let's come back and kind of share what you've been talking about. What are some of the problems with society today that are downstream from enacting these kinds of views?
Focus drugs to self-interest, like you really care about fuel,
Yeah. Being socially conditioned to accept these views kind of leads a little bit to self-interested lifestyles, right? In a sense. Here's another critique. Is our society super fair and equitable? Or is there inequality between people? When you put liberalism into play, these kinds of policies, if you do it imperfectly, right, people are not going to always succeed through no fault of their own, because we don't have socialistic safety nets. Sure, we have welfare and we have some other social safety nets. But when you don't have wide-scale social safety nets like that, people will fall through the cracks, right? They will not get what they need. There's also, because the focus is on the individual, critics are going to say a lack of understanding and compassion for social groups. Because if everybody's just an individual, right, what does talking about a social group matter? Right? Each individual is distinct and different. Critics would argue, if you internalize this view, you become kind of blind to the different challenges and struggles and inequalities that certain social groups face. So these are some of the problems with this view. Let's now move on to the next one. Let's talk about socialism, the second primary ideology Alexander discusses. This political ideology is a lot more collectivistic. Okay, it's not individualistic like classical liberalism is. It's associated with collective equality, making sure every individual has equal opportunity, equal rights, equal wealth and property, you might say, and some of the other ideologies that are downstream from this. Socialism, and you might say one category of socialism, communism, are for not the privatization of wealth and property, but the collective ownership of the means of production and property. The idea is something like, you shouldn't have private property, a piece of land that you own that only you can use and only you can step on. Rather, the idea should be all the members of a society should collectively own the property and the goods and make decisions about what gets produced, where goods and resources are allocated, and so on, rather than letting the free market determine these things. Generally, you can say that this ideology is also associated in some sense with altruism, right? The idea in socialistic and communistic ideologies is something like people should give what they can to help support their fellow human being. They shouldn't hoard any resources or wealth for themselves, but they should give freely to the other people in their society who are struggling or who can't work, who are falling through the cracks. Socially, we have some sort of responsibility to make sure all the other members of our society stay afloat and they're happy and they're getting their needs met. This is a social obligation that we have. And so they're not going to be in support of a free market economy, what you might call a laissez-faire economy that a lot of people in the West have. Instead, they want the economy to be something that is controlled or governed by some sort of central planning committee or organization, or by the people in a stateless society, depending on if you're talking about socialism or communism. And we'll talk about the distinction between these two in a second. But the idea is something like the economy isn't determined by these outside forces like supply and demand and how people are feeling on a certain day and the rationality of individuals and the choices they make. But rather, the people democratically determine what the economy looks like, what the prices of goods are, which goods get produced, to whom they get sold, so on and so forth. Collective ownership, democratically deciding how society is run in every aspect of human life, socially, politically, economically, is a hallmark of this ideology. Okay? And again, there's a strong insistence on this idea that we have some sort of social or political obligation to look out for everybody else in society. You don't really see that in liberalism, right? The classical liberal is going to say, well, I'll try to help you out if I can, but your life is your own, buddy. You got to work on it. I'm not going to give you everything I have. You got to work hard. You got to have a good work ethic, so on and so forth. Whereas the communist or the socialist will be like, no, we all have this obligation to help others. Give freely when you can give. Hold people up together. This kind of thing. And so socialism is going to conceive of the self differently than liberalism. It's not going to say that the self is this separate, autonomous, rational thing that is completely different from what's going on around it and has nothing to do with what's going on around it. No, instead it's going to say what it means to be a person is to be some sort of amalgamation of social and material influences. The socialist is going to say something like, the individual that you are today is a direct result of the kind of society you were born into, the kind of traditions you were made aware of or practiced, the religion that was given to you by your parents, the kind of economy that structures the society in which you live, the kind of laws that you have to follow. All of these social and political forces are making you who you are. Okay? You're not a thing that's separate from society, like liberalism says. You are a product of society. And not a product as in, like a table or a chair or a mattress, but like, an output. If you imagine society as like a machine that has inputs and outputs, So, they're going to say we are who we are because we are all cogs in this social machine. The society in which we live makes us who we are. The access that we have to resources, Marx is going to say, makes us who we are, determines the kind of consciousness that we have. How we think and who we are is not distinct and separate from this stuff. It is that stuff. And so we cannot separate ourselves from our social conditions. We are who we are because of those social conditions. And so they see the self as something that is more like a product of the society, less like an individual autonomous thing separate from what's going on around it. I'd like to go over just a little bit more on this ideology, and then we'll talk about critiques. It sees the liberal conception of the self as a myth. Okay? It's going to say no individual is separate from the society and social conditions that make up their life. The reason you have the views you do, the values you do, the political beliefs you do, is because society has basically made you that way. And consequently, that means that you owe some kind of debt to society, to the upkeep of society, to the people in society, because all of these different forces are allowing you to live and survive and make you who you are today. One variant, Marxism, takes this a step further and says that actually what makes you who you are the material conditions of the society. And what Marx means by material conditions are things like what is being produced, who is producing it, the resources that your society has access to, who has control over those resources, who decides where those resources get put, what gets produced, how much gets produced, all of this stuff. These are material conditions because they're physical things, right? Physical structures and processes. And so what Marx is going to go on to say is the consciousness and the views and the values that you have are a direct result of what these material conditions are like. The kind of mind that you have, whatever's going on up here, is a direct result of all of this material stuff. That's what determines the views that you have. Your views of people, your views of the society, your values. And so what he tries to do in his philosophy is explain the development of human society by analyzing the material conditions of societies throughout human history. Marx famously said that feudalism gave rise to capitalism, which eventually will inevitably give rise to socialism, which will then give rise to communism, a stateless society in which the members of the community collectively own and decide how that society is operated. But if you'd like a tiny little lesson in political theory, a lot of Marxists in the 20th century realized that Marx was wrong because all of these communities were not rising up against their capitalistic overlords. Socialism was not being brought about. And so they ended up changing from their strategy from engaging in economic critiques of material conditions, to cultural critiques. Which is why we have critical theory today, critical race theory, critical gender theory, criticizing the culture of society as being the thing that is reproducing the systems that we have. It's not just the material things, it's the education, and it's the institutions, and it's the culture. Implicitly within this ideology is a critique of capitalism and capitalistic economies. What you might call free market economies. They critique this kind of way of handling economics because it ends up producing inequality between people. Wealth ends up being accumulated in the hands of a few people at the top. Think Jeff Bezos, Elon Musk, right, who have obscene amounts of wealth. And there are a bunch of people left on the bottom who aren't able to make ends meet, or are barely surviving, or are not getting what they need. And so socialism is going to critique capitalism in this way, free market economies, and say that it's always going to result in inequality. It's always going to be unfair to the people who can't live and work like the other members of that society in the same way. And this is a problem. It's always going to result in these problems, so we should get rid of it. We should have a more planned, controlled economy in which the people decide what's going on collectively, intentionally. Now, to kind of go back to what I mentioned before, to give you just a brief distinction, there is a difference between socialism and communism. These words are often thrown around interchangeably. They're not interchangeable in social political theory. Okay? Socialism is a political ideology which is supposed to describe a situation in which there is state or government ownership of property and the means of production. That is, the political representatives, the government people decide what gets produced, how much gets produced, who that goes to, etc. Communism, Marx said, is the step after that, the society that comes after that. Once people have internalized that this is the way that it ought to be, then Marx said that the state, the government would dissolve, people would have no need for it anymore. They would just naturally, collectively decide what to do with the stuff of their own free will. They wouldn't need a state or a government telling them to do this and enforcing that. So communism, to distinguish it from socialism, is a society in which there isn't a state, there isn't a government, that has dissolved away, but people just naturally help out others, decide what the economy produces, and so on, together democratically. There's community ownership of property and the means of production. Those things aren't decided by some power that's above us, some governmental or state power above us. Now, socialism certainly has some desirable ideals and values, but talk to the person next to you again and try to see if you can find any problems with it. Any problems with socialism or communism? Talk about that with the people around you. How good do you know your world history? How did the Soviet Union end?
That was bad for me there. I'm waiting for it.
Really bad. It is not an exaggeration. Tens of millions of
It got delivered. Amazon said it got delivered.
as a result of trying to. Now, what the communists and the socialists is going to say is, well, that's because they didn't do
No way. They could have delivered
right. These people in power, that's Stalin. They took the power they acquired for themselves. They had these rival parties. They were actually redistributing it to the members of society. So maybe that's a good response.
I don't know.
But as we'll see in practice, that's the
No. It said Greensburg. Well, why would it be that?
maybe that's because humans are
If it got delivered in Greensburg.
I'm not sure.
I mean, I'm okay to come tomorrow.
Think about that. Think of any society which is successful.
Well, because you automatically set it up for your house.
Okay, let's bring it back to the front now. What did y'all talk about in your groups? What problems are there, if any, with socialism or communism?
It kind of goes back to what we were talking about with Rousseau and politics. That people are self-interested, and there's always going to be someone within socialism or communism that wants to be better off than everyone else. It's like why countries have failed when they try to.
That last part is important. You said countries have failed. Which countries are you talking about?
The USSR, right? That's what they tried to do it.
You might say the Soviet Union. You might say Maoist China when he tried to institute the Great Leap Forward. You might say Venezuela, Cuba, other Southern American countries. I admire the aims and the ideals of this view. But what we have noticed throughout history, and the 20th century is the perfect example of this, is that whenever these policies have been instituted in large-scale societies, they have resulted in the deaths of tens of millions of people. One estimate says that within the 20th century, due to the rise of communism within China and the Soviet Union alone, over 100 million people were killed. That is not good. Okay, can you imagine 100 million people dead? Insane. That's a lot of people. What percentage of the U.S. population would that be? Like a third? A little less than a third? Something like that? So the problem with these views is that when they've been put into practice, they've never succeeded. They've always resulted in widespread oppression, death, discrimination. Now you might say that is because these societies weren't implementing the policies properly. And that's a fair response, right? But if it's true that we can't, according to our own human nature, implement them properly, well, then this ideology is a dead end. That hasn't been shown, though, right? It might be possible to institute this on a large scale. It certainly doesn't seem to be a problem on a smaller scale, right? You can think of communities in which people look out for one another. They collectively decide how the community is run. When you have a small group of people, and that seems to work well. But when you try to institute these policies on a mass scale, it has always ended up failing in human history. Which again, doesn't mean it's always going to fail, but it's something that we need to keep in the back of our minds. Okay, now let's move on to talk about the last ideology, conservatism. What kinds of concepts are associated with conservatism? When you think of the American conservative, what comes to mind? What do they say? What do they do? What do they believe in?
Resistant to fast changes.
Right. They are resistant to innovation and social change. Right? What else? Are American conservatives atheists? What do you think? No, what are they?
Christian.
They're religious, right? They're Christian. Because our society is basically based on Christian values and the Christian God. Right? What else are they? Did they want to decrease military spending? They really hate the military. Fuck the military. No, they're pro-military, right? They have respect for the military. They support the military. You might say they have a general respect for authority as well, right? For elected officials, elected representatives. Conservatism is associated with traditional values, systems, and structures. Resistance to innovation or social and political and economic change. They are normally religious. They have a respect an admiration for religion. In the West, that is the Christian religion, right? Judaism as well, for there is this respect and admiration for Judeo-Christian values. Conservatism is associated with respect for authority, respect for the military. Like the liberal, they are also in support of property rights, though perhaps more than the classical liberal. And they also value family and ancestry, bloodlines, right? All of this is because they conceptualize the self differently than the other two ideologies. What conservatism is going to say is that the human person is a product of history. That is, we are who we are because of our family history, because of what people have done in the past, because of the way society was run in the past. All of that stuff informs who we are today and allows us to live and survive today. Because of all that stuff in the past happened a certain way. Okay? Thus, it is unsurprising that this conception of the self leads them to think that we have certain social and moral obligations both to the dead and to the unborn. And this is something that you see in American conservatism, right? Support for veterans and support for people who have died in war, and generally pro-life stances. This is because they see history. They think that if history wasn't the way that it was, we wouldn't be here today. If certain structures and systems and values hadn't historically been in place, we wouldn't be alive today doing what we're doing. They think there is wisdom in the traditions and the old ways. Because it's worked for us up to this point. Right? We haven't blown ourselves up yet. We haven't died. Wide-scale social collapse that kills the human species has not occurred since we've relied on these old stories and religions and traditions, since we've had respect for authority, since we've followed these traditional Judeo-Christian values. So they're going to look to the past, and they're going to note what has been good and useful about the past in order to inform how they're going to look at the future. Therefore, they're going to be resistant to innovation and change, because they're thinking to themselves, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. Right? A lot of American conservatives will think to themselves, well, look, I was able to get a job, I was then able to buy a house, I was able to do all these things, it worked for me. Right? Why would I want to change that? Why would we want to institute all these new and radical changes that might fuck everything up? And so they'll be very cautious about changing things too radically. Alexander says, conservatives argue that there is no obligation to change the world because of human imperfection on the one hand, and no obligation to change the world because of unforeseen consequences on the other. These things make it impossible to know that any change will be for the better. Right? Why change things if you don't have to? Why change things if they worked up until this point? If we have found wisdom and guidance and good things from the old religions and the old ways of thinking about things. Right? And so they're going to say that there's truth and wisdom to be found in the past, in the things that our ancestors did, in our ancestors' way of life, the beliefs and values that our ancestors had, because if they didn't have those beliefs and values and did those behaviors, we wouldn't be here today. Right? So they're going to say there are good things. Tradition and traditional values are good things. Okay? They've been working. They've been doing well for us. We shouldn't just change them willy-nilly. And a lot of them are going to rely on what is called Chesterton's fence. G.K. Chesterton, who was an Orthodox Christian and philosopher, once put the following thought example to people. If you come across a fence in the field, just an open field, and you don't know why the fence is there or who put it up, he says, you shouldn't tear the fence down. It served a purpose at some point. Maybe it's still serving a purpose. You don't know what that purpose is. Why change things if things are fine the way they are? And if you no longer recognize what the purpose or reasons are for having certain values or certain traditions or certain ways of life. This is kind of the way that a conservative will think. The problem with this view, and we don't have too much time to go into it, is that it's kind of a political ideology that is doomed to fail. For starters, it's not clear that everything that has happened in the past has been good, right? There are things that we would like to change that people in the past did that were bad, like discrimination, like slavery, like female genital mutilation, which is still occurring across the world, right? Just because we've done things in the past doesn't make them good and right? But what's more than this is that society is inevitably going to change. Now we live in a situation in which we're connected globally to all these countries, all these different ways of life, all these different views, thanks to digital media and the internet and our news cycle. People's views are changing. People's attitudes and beliefs are changing. The conservative is kind of doomed to stand atop the hill of history and yell stop while the ground moves out from under them. Things inevitably change. Societies are not static. And so they're engaged kind of in a failing enterprise, an enterprise that is inevitably going to fail. And again, it's not clear that all of the old ways and traditions and stories are right and good. Right? Sometimes change is a good, sometimes change is a necessity. Any questions on conservatism? Okay. So I'd like to just summarize now. This is a helpful table that I created based on Alexander's piece that is going to help us see how these different ideologies are distinct from one another. So you'll notice they have different views about what we should be emancipated from, different views about what kind of equality we should seek after and promote, and they have different views about what the relationship should be between religion and society. According to Alexander, when it comes to liberalism, classical liberals think that we should be free to be emancipated from tradition. We should be able to live our lives as we see fit, whether that is in line with tradition or not in line with tradition. We should be able to follow our own path. We shouldn't be held down and constrained by the religions and the stories and the ways of life that came before us. In contrast to this, socialism is going to say, in a weird way, we need to become emancipated from this conception of individual liberty. Because this conception of individual liberty is what's allowing inequality to be produced and reproduced in society. This idea that you have to look out for yourself, that it's your goals and desires that matter, that your rights that matter, internalizing this view too strongly ends up resulting in the kind of social and economic inequalities that we see today, and that's bad. So this idea that individual liberty is what matters, we should evolve from that to recognize that actually social health and community is what matters. And there's certain moral and social obligations we have to each other. Finally, conservatism is going to say, we need to be emancipated from this abstract idea that complete and total freedom is ever going to be possible. The liberal conceives of society as something that should give the human person as much freedom as possible. Socialism says, actually, we get more freedom if we all get more freedom in a paradoxical way if we help each other out, because then we're not constrained by the different aspects of our individual lives. If we actually show up for our political and social obligations, we'll all have more freedom because we'll all be living better lives and we won't have to worry about working 60 hours a week. Conservatism says these things are pie-in-the-sky myths. Okay? There has always been a tenuous relationship between the freedom of the individual and the things that constrain them. You have moral obligations. You have political and social obligations. No country is ever going to give you this ultimate heavenly freedom that you're looking for. Okay, society is always going to fall short. There are always going to be things constraining you. We need to be liberated from this fanciful, crazy idea that we're all going to live totally happily and peacefully in an anarchic society where there's no laws and no people telling us what to do. No, there are always going to be people telling you what to do. This has always been the case. We need to get that idea, rid of that idea. They also differ on what they say about equality. Liberalism is going to advocate for equality of each individual, and what they mean by that generally is what they call equality of opportunity, which is equality under the law, which is different from what people nowadays call equity. Equity is different than equality, and I'll explain this when we get to socialism. Socialism is going to say that we should have equality for each socially constructed individual. Okay? It's not fair that based on somebody's race or gender or class that they don't get access to the same resources that others do. They face more challenges and more obstacles. That's not fair, the socialist is going to say. So we need to recognize that we're all a product of social forces, and basically what we need to do is make it so that things are equitable. Everybody has the same amount of property and wealth and access and opportunity. Not varying levels of wealth and power and access to opportunity. Conservatism, because it is religiously tinted a lot, is not going to advocate so much for making sure that everybody has the same shit and has the same lifestyle and everybody's happy. Rather, they're going to say something like, well, we're all equal under the sovereign rule of the divine power of God. That is the state of affairs. Try as we might to try to make people better off by making these social safety nets or safeguarding their individual liberties. It's never going to be perfect. Instead, we should orient ourselves to the divine rather than worry so much about social political matters. Finally, they all have a different relationship, or think religion should have a different relationship to society. Liberalism thinks that there should be separation of church and state. The church shouldn't determine the kind of social and economic policy that we have. These should be separate institutions. Socialism, on the other hand, thinks that these two things should kind of be merged into one higher, better thing that is not dogmatic, that is not constraining, but kind of in Hegelian and Marxist philosophy, this is called a sublation, where you take two things that are contradictory and you put them together, and from that you get a higher, better, more perfect thing. So they think church and state should be sublated. And then conservatism is going to say, actually, religious and spiritual matters should be prioritized over social matters. Ideally, what that would look like socially is that the church actually plays a large role in determining social policy and economic policy, rather than there being a separation, like in liberalism. Okay. Well, thank you all for coming. I hope you all have a better sense of these ideologies now. Talk about this stuff with your friends. See where you line up politically. You know, those conversations are always interesting. Don't be mean, though. Don't shit on someone just because of their political views, all right? We're all in this together, right? We're all in this together.